The gates stood open at 3 in the morning, and Lila Zhao was teaching 4 grown men to read by candlelight in a castle scullery that smelled of lye and old stone. "Inventory," she said, tapping the laundry ledger. "Say it with me." "Inventory," they chorused, their voices rough from centuries of disuse. 3 of them were mortal servants like her, bound by debt or desperation. The 4th was a turned vampire barely 50 years old who'd never learned his letters as a human and was too ashamed to ask his betters now. "Good. Now what does it mean?" "A list of things," said Marcus, the youngest mortal, pride warming his face. Lila smiled and passed him the chalk. 18 months ago, she'd walked through those same gates as a hostage, the human pledge her border town of Millbrook owed the vampire court under a truce her grandfather had negotiated. She'd volunteered so that Daniel Chen, the neighbor's 19-year-old son, wouldn't have to go. He had a sick mother and a future. She'd had a degree in library science, a dead-end job at a chain bookstore, and the certainty that someone ought to do something. She hadn't expected to find purpose here, in the margins of an immortal world that barely noticed her. She taught reading in the scullery. She organized the court's chaotic archives. She translated old border agreements into plain language so both sides could actually understand them. Small work, unglamorous work, but hers. The castle door creaked open. Lila turned, and her heart performed its customary betrayal, leaping and twisting in her chest. Eradan Lothair, vampire king of the northern reaches, stood in the doorway with moonlight spilling around him like a cloak. He was as pale as frost, his hair the silver white of starlight, his features sharp enough to cut. He wore modern clothes, a black shirt and dark trousers, but he moved like something from an older world, all predatory grace and absolute certainty. His eyes, storm gray and ancient, found her immediately. "Teaching again," he said. Not a question. "The ledgers won't read themselves," Lila replied, keeping her voice steady. "And your steward refuses to translate them into anything a mortal can understand. He believes in the old ways." Eradan stepped into the room, and the 4 men immediately bowed. He waved them up with an impatient gesture. "Continue your lesson. I need only a moment of Miss Zhao's time." Lila handed the chalk to Marcus and followed the king into the corridor. The stone passage was lit by electric lights installed decades ago, an odd marriage of medieval architecture and modern convenience that characterized the whole castle. Eradan walked ahead of her, his hands clasped behind his back, tension radiating from his shoulders. "Your term expires tonight," he said without preamble. 18 months, as the treaty specifies. Lila stopped walking. She'd known this was coming. The date was written into the agreement, immutable as law. But somehow she'd let herself forget, let the days blur into routine and purpose and the dangerous unspoken thing that had been growing between her and the king for the past year. "I see," she managed. "I came to tell you myself." He turned to face her, and his expression was carefully blank, the way it always was when he was hiding something. "You're free to go, tonight. I'll open the gates personally and provide you with funds for travel. A car will take you to the bus station. No one will follow you or contact you again unless you wish it." "That's very generous." Her throat felt tight. "It's the law." His jaw clenched. "The treaty is clear. 18 months of honorable service, then release with no debt or obligation. You've fulfilled your pledge 10 times over, Lila. You've earned your freedom." She wanted to ask why he looked like it was killing him to say this. She wanted to ask why he'd started saying her first name 6 months ago, dropping the formal Miss Zhao when they were alone. She wanted to ask why he'd begun finding excuses to see her, to ask her opinion on treaty revisions and archive organization and 100 other things he could have delegated to anyone. "When?" she asked instead. "Now. The gates will open at 4 and you'll be on the first bus out at dawn." He pulled an envelope from his pocket and held it out. "Enough money to start over anywhere you choose, more if you need it. Simply send word." Lila took the envelope with numb fingers. It was heavy, stuffed thick with cash. "Thank you." "Don't." The word came out harsh. He softened it immediately, but she'd heard the crack in his composure. "Don't thank me for keeping my word, for giving you what was always yours." "Your Majesty," Eradan. He said it quietly, almost desperately. After 18 months, I think you can call me Eradan. She met his eyes, those storm-gray depths that had watched empires rise and fall, and saw something raw and bleeding there. Eradan, then. Why does this feel like you're angry with me? I'm not. He turned away, facing the dark window. I'm angry with myself. With circumstance. With time. A pause. With the fact that I cannot ask you to stay. Her heart stopped, restarted, began hammering. Why not? Because you deserve the choice. Because a century ago I made someone stay who should have been free to go, and I have never forgiven myself. His voice was low, wrecked. I was younger then, more arrogant. I had a ward, a mortal boy I'd raised from childhood after his village was destroyed. I loved him as a son. When he turned 18, he wanted to leave, to see the world beyond these walls. And I forbade it. I used duty and obligation and 1,000 arguments to chain him here, because I couldn't bear to lose him. What happened? Lila whispered. He walked out those gates one night and I never saw him again. He died 3 years later in a foreign city, alone, having spent his precious freedom running from the cage I'd made of love. Eradan's hands were fists at his sides. So I swore I would never make anyone stay again. I would honor every letter of every treaty. I would open the gates and let them go, no matter what it cost me. Even if they want to stay. The words escaped before Lila could stop them. Eradan went very still. Even then. Because how would I know the difference between genuine choice and a captive survival strategy? How could I trust that you weren't simply telling me what I wanted to hear? Maybe you could ask me, Lila said, anger flaring now, bright and hot. Maybe you could trust me to know my own mind. He turned, and his face was a study in conflict, hope and fear warring across features too proud to hide either. Lila, you want me to go? She interrupted. Fine. Open your gates. I'll walk through them. But don't you dare pretend this is for my benefit when it's really about your guilt. She spun on her heel and walked away before he could respond, before the tears burning behind her eyes could fall. She heard him call her name once, soft and broken, but she didn't turn back. She couldn't. She returned to the scullery and finished the lesson with shaking hands. She packed her few belongings. She'd arrived with almost nothing, and had acquired little, and changed into jeans and a sweater, mortal clothes that felt strange after 18 months of the simple dresses the court provided. At 4 o'clock precisely, she walked to the main gates. Eradan was there, as promised. He stood beside the massive iron doors, his face a mask of royal composure. The gates were already open, pulled back to reveal the long driveway and the road beyond. A sleek black car waited, engine running. Safe travels, Lila Zhao, he said formally. You have served with honor. The northern reaches are in your debt. It was a dismissal, polite and absolute. Lila wanted to scream. She wanted to grab him by his expensive shirt and shake him until he admitted what she could see in his eyes every time he looked at her. But he'd made his choice. Or rather, he'd let his past make it for him. Goodbye, Eradan, she said, and walked through the gates. The drive to town took 20 minutes. The driver, a taciturn vampire named Yosef, didn't try to make conversation, which suited Lila fine. She stared out the window and watched the castle disappear behind trees and hills. Her chest ached, her eyes burned. She'd done the right thing, hadn't she? She couldn't stay where she wasn't wanted, where her presence was just a reminder of past failures and broken hearts. Except that wasn't true, and she knew it. Eradan did want her to stay. He just didn't trust himself enough to ask, didn't trust her enough to believe her answer. The bus station was nearly empty at this hour, a fluorescent-lit box of plastic chairs and vending machines. The next bus to anywhere useful left at 6:30. Lila bought a ticket to the state capitol and sat down to wait. She opened the envelope Eradan had given her and counted $5,000 in neat hundreds. Enough to start over, enough to disappear. 2. She was staring at the money, trying to figure out what starting over even meant, when she heard familiar voices near the station entrance. Told you, the timing's perfect. She'll confirm the court's weak, that they let her go without a fight. That's our opening. Lila's head snapped up. She knew that voice. Councilman Peter Brooks from Millbrook, a man who'd voted against the treaty from the beginning and had made no secret of his belief that vampires should be eradicated, not negotiated with. She eased out of her chair and moved closer, keeping behind a support pillar. The hunters arrive tomorrow night, Brooks was saying to two other men Lila recognized from Millbrook's town council. We'll have the Zhao girls' testimony that they're honorable to their treaties but militarily complacent. The hunters can go in hard and fast, wipe out the leadership before they organize a defense. And if the girl doesn't cooperate? One of the others asked nervously. Then we don't need her. Her return is proof enough. We've already put out word that the Vampire King is weak, sentimental, lets humans walk away. It's blood in the water for every hunter crew on the East Coast. Lila's blood turned to ice. They were using her release as propaganda. They were going to attack the court, massacre everyone there, not just Eradan, but Marcus and the other servants, the minor vampires who'd never hurt anyone, the staff who'd become her friends. What about casualties? The nervous man asked. Acceptable losses, Brooks said coldly. We'll rebuild once the monsters are gone. Make Millbrook great again the way it was before we bent the knee to corpses and blood drinkers. They moved past her pillar and out into the parking lot. Lila stood frozen, her mind racing. She had to warn them. She had to stop this. The court had no idea it was coming. The treaty had held for 30 years, and Eradan trusted it, trusted that the humans on the border wanted peace as much as he did. She looked down at the bus ticket in her hand. The gates were open. The road was free. She could get on that bus and leave this behind. She'd fulfilled her obligation. She'd earned her fresh start. No one could blame her for choosing her own safety. Except she would blame herself. Every single day for the rest of her life, she would blame herself. And more than that, more than duty or guilt or even friendship, was the realization crystallizing in her chest like ice forming on glass. She didn't want to leave. She hadn't wanted to leave for months now. She'd built a life in that castle, a purpose, a home. She'd built something with Eradan too, something fragile and unspoken but real, something that shouldn't end because he was too haunted to ask and she was too proud to admit what she felt without being asked. She'd been falling in love with him at the same maddening, careful speed he'd been falling for her, and she'd let him send her away without saying it. Lila shredded the bus ticket and ran. There were no cabs at this hour, and calling Yosef felt impossible. What if Eradan had ordered him not to bring her back? She ran to the main road and stuck out her thumb, praying. The third car stopped, a battered pickup driven by an older woman who took one look at Lila's face and said, "Where you need to go, honey?" "The Lothair estate," Lila gasped. "Please, it's an emergency." The woman's eyes widened. Everyone in the region knew the Lothair estate, even if they pretended they didn't. "You sure about that?" "More sure than I've ever been about anything." The drive back took forever and no time at all. Lila's mind spun out scenarios, plans, warnings. She had to tell Eradan about the hunters. She had to warn him that Brooks was already spreading propaganda, poisoning the border towns against the court. And then, if there was a then, if he didn't send her away again, she had to tell him the truth. That she'd chosen this. That she was choosing him. The gates were closed when they arrived. Lila thanked the woman, pressed two of Eradan's $100 bills into her hands over her protests, and ran to the intercom. "This is Lila Zhao. I need to see the king. Now." There was a long pause. Then Yosef's voice, confused and wary. "Miss Zhao, you're supposed to be. I know where I'm supposed to be. I need to see Eradan immediately. There's going to be an attack." The gates swung open. Lila ran up the long driveway, her lungs burning. The front doors opened before she reached them, and Eradan stood there in the same clothes from before, looking at her like she was a ghost. "Lila, what? Hunters?" she gasped out. "Coming tomorrow night. Councilman Brooks from Millbrook is coordinating it. They're using my release as proof that you're weak. They're going to try to massacre the court." Eradan's expression went from shocked to coldly furious in half a heartbeat. He caught her elbow and pulled her inside, already calling orders. Within minutes, the castle was mobilized. Vampires appeared from nowhere, moving with deadly purpose. Eradan convened an emergency council in the Great Hall while Lila repeated everything she'd overheard. "They'll come at night," said Severina, Eradan's second in command, a terrifyingly competent vampire with ice-white hair braided down her back. "They'll expect that to be our advantage, but they'll have counters. Fire, probably. Maybe explosives." "We should strike first," snarled Nikolai, the master-at-arms. "Go to Millbrook tonight and drag Brooks out of his bed. Make an example." "No!" Eradan's voice was flat, absolute. "That's exactly what he wants. Violence that he can spin into proof that we're monsters. We won't play that game." "Then what?" Nikolai demanded. "We wait for them to come here and defend? Let them dictate terms?" "We expose them," Lila said. Everyone turned to look at her. She swallowed hard but held her ground. "Brooks is acting without the full council's knowledge. I recognize the men with him, and they're extremists. Most of Millbrook's council voted for the treaty. They want peace." "You're suggesting we appeal to mortal politics?" Severina asked, one elegant eyebrow raised. "I'm suggesting we take away their justification. Call an emergency meeting with the full Millbrook Council, tonight. Present them with evidence that Brooks is planning an unsanctioned attack. Force them to choose publicly whether they stand with the treaty or with the hunters. They'll choose their own kind," Nikolai said bitterly. "Maybe," Lila admitted. "But maybe not. The treaty has been good for Millbrook. Trade, protection, stability. Brooks is gambling that they'll choose fear over prosperity. Prove him wrong." Eradan was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You came back to tell me this," he said slowly. "You could have run. You could have been safe." "I came back for a lot of reasons." Her voice was steady now. "Sure. But we can discuss that after we've prevented a massacre." His eyes flashed. "Indeed, we can." The next few hours were a controlled chaos of phone calls, negotiations, and barely veiled threats. It turned out that vampire kings had remarkable leverage when they chose to use it. By noon, an emergency session of the Millbrook Town Council had been called for 7 that evening, with Eradan Lothair and a delegation from the northern reaches formally invited to attend. "It's a trap," Nikolai warned. "They'll have hunters waiting." "Then we'll be ready for them," Eradan replied. "But I don't think it will come to that." He was right. When they arrived at Millbrook's town hall that evening, Eradan, Severina, Nikolai, and Lila, they found the council chamber packed with citizens. Word had spread, as word does in small towns, that something big was happening. Brooks sat at the council table looking gray-faced and cornered. Mayor Sandra West, a pragmatic woman in her 60s who'd championed the original treaty, called the meeting to order. "Mr. Lothair, you requested this session. The floor is yours." Eradan stood. He dressed for the occasion in a dark suit that made him look like death and money in equal measure. When he spoke, his voice carried without effort to every corner of the room. 30 years ago, your grandparents and mine negotiated a treaty that ended a century of bloodshed. That treaty is held because both sides have honored it. I come before you tonight to report that Councilman Brooks has violated that treaty by inviting a hunter crew to attack my court. He plans to use the lawful release of Lila Zhao, a human hostage who completed her term of service, as propaganda to justify this attack. The room erupted. Brooks surged to his feet, shouting denials, but Mayor West banged her gavel and demanded silence. "These are serious accusations," she said. "Do you have proof?" "I heard him," Lila said, standing up. The room went quiet. She'd grown up 20 miles from here, and plenty of people recognized her. At the bus station this morning. He was meeting with Councilman Harris and Councilman Trent. He said the hunters arrive tomorrow night. He said they'd use my return as proof that the court is weak. Harris and Trent, 2 men at the end of the council table, looked at each other and then away. It was as good as a confession. "Is this true?" Mayor West demanded, staring at Brooks. "We have a right to defend ourselves," Brooks shot back. "The treaty made us weak. We're the ones who send hostages, who pay tribute in blood bags and donations. What do we get? The privilege of living next to monsters who could slaughter us in our beds. You get peace," Eradan said quietly. You get protection from the ferals that I and mine hunt down in your territory. You get trade routes that we keep safe. You get our word that no one under my authority will harm you without cause. That treaty has saved more human lives than you can count, Brooks. And you would throw it away for what? Pride? Fear? Principle, Brooks spat. We shouldn't have to negotiate with corpses. Then you're welcome to leave the protections of the treaty, Eradan said, and his voice dropped to something cold and deadly. The rest of your town need not follow you into stupidity. Mayor West, I propose an amendment to our agreement. We will abolish the hostage system entirely. That caused another uproar. Even Lila gasped. Eradan held up a hand. It's an outdated practice, a relic of an earlier time. Instead, I propose the creation of a mortal envoy's office, a human representative who chooses to work with the court, facilitating communication and resolving disputes before they escalate. Someone both sides trust, someone who's already proven their commitment to peace. He turned to look at Lila. If she'll have the position. Lila's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. An envoy, a permanent position, a reason to stay that was entirely her choice. I'll do it, she said, on one condition. The envoy position comes with real authority, not just advisory. I want the power to investigate complaints on both sides and mandate resolutions. I want regular town halls where humans and vampires can air grievances publicly. I want transparency. Done, Eradan said immediately. Mayor West was nodding slowly. I like it. A permanent liaison. Someone who's not a hostage but a professional. Councilwoman Chen, what do you think? An older woman near the middle of the table spoke up. I think Lila Zhao served her term with honor and came back to warn us of a threat to the treaty at great personal risk. I think that shows character. I'd trust her in that role. Seconded, said another counselor. Brooks slammed his hand on the table. This is insanity. You're letting them manipulate you. That girl has Stockholm Syndrome. She's been brainwashed. I've been respected. Lila cut him off, her voice ringing clear. I've been given meaningful work and treated like an equal. I've learned their language and their customs, and I've taught them ours. I've built relationships and solved problems. That's not brainwashing, Councilman. That's collaboration, and it's a hell of a lot more productive than the fear and hatred you're selling. The crowd erupted in applause. Not everyone there were still plenty of faces that looked skeptical or hostile, but enough to tip the scales. Mayor West let the applause die down before speaking. I'm calling for a vote, all in favor of abolishing the hostage system and establishing a mortal envoy's office, with Lila Zhao serving as our first envoy. Say aye. Aye, rang out from 6 of the 9 councilors. Motion carries. The treaty is amended effective immediately. Councilman Brooks, you are removed from your position pending a full investigation into your actions. If you have indeed invited hunters to our territory without council authorization, you'll face charges of treason. Brooks looked like he was going to have a stroke. You can't. She just did, Eradan said mildly. And as for the hunters you've invited, I suggest you contact them immediately and inform them that their services are no longer required. If they arrive in my territory looking for a fight, they will find one. And I promise you, Councilman, it will not end the way you hope. The threat was delivered in the same mild tone, but every vampire in the room had suddenly become very present, very still, very dangerous. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Brooks looked around, found no support, and stormed out. Harris and Trent followed him, looking shaken. The meeting dissolved into discussion after that. Lila spent an hour fielding questions and shaking hands and accepting congratulations from people she barely knew. Eradan stayed close, a silent presence at her shoulder, radiating protection and barely suppressed intensity. Finally, they made it back to the car. The drive to the castle was silent. Lila was exhausted, running on adrenaline and emotion and the dawning realization of what she'd just agreed to. A permanent position, a life split between 2 worlds, a chance to build something real. You didn't have to do that, she said as they pulled up to the gates. Abolish the hostage system, that's a huge concession. It was time, Eradan replied. Past time, truthfully. You simply gave me the push I needed." He turned to look at her, and his eyes were molten. "You came back." "I did." "Why?" Lila took a breath. They were alone in the back of the car. Yosef was pretending not to listen from the driver's seat. This was it. The moment she'd run back for. "Because I heard them planning to attack you, and I couldn't let that happen. But that's not the only reason. I came back because I don't want to leave. I came back because I've been falling in love with you for months. And you were too noble and too damaged to admit you felt the same, and I was too proud to say it first. But I'm saying it now. I choose this. I choose you. I choose staying." Eradan looked at her like she'd pulled down the moon and handed it to him. "Lila, if you tell me you can't trust that I mean it, I will scream," she warned. "I just turned down freedom and safety and a normal life to come back here. I stood in front of my entire town and declared that I'm on your side. I'm taking a job that basically makes me a permanent liaison between worlds. What more proof do you need that this is my choice?" "None," he breathed. "I need no more proof. I surrender. You're right. You've been right all along, and I was a fool and a coward, and I love you so much it terrifies me." Then he kissed her. It was desperate and gentle at once, his hands framing her face like she was something precious and breakable. Lila kissed him back with 18 months of longing and frustration and hope, pouring everything she hadn't been able to say into the press of her lips against his. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard. Eradan rested his forehead against hers. "I don't deserve you," he murmured. "Probably not," Lila agreed, smiling. "But you're stuck with me anyway." They went inside together. The castle staff, who'd apparently been eavesdropping shamelessly, broke into spontaneous applause. Marcus hugged her and didn't let go until she laughingly threatened to start his next reading lesson with advanced grammar. That night, Lila stood in Eradan's private study while he poured her a glass of wine and himself a crystal goblet of blood. It should have been weird, but somehow it wasn't. This was who he was, who they both were now. "Tell me about your ward," she said softly. "The boy who left." Eradan was quiet for a long moment. Then he began to speak, telling her about Tobias, the mortal child he'd rescued from a burned village and raised as a son, how he'd loved the boy's curiosity and courage, how he'd held on too tight when Tobias grew up and wanted to see the world, how Tobias had left anyway and Eradan had been too proud to follow, too convinced that Tobias would come back. How he'd gotten word 3 years later that Tobias had died of pneumonia in a London slum, alone and broke. "I killed him," Eradan said, his voice rough with old grief. "Not with my hands, but with my pride and my fear. If I'd let him go with my blessing, with support, with money, he might have lived. Instead, I made his freedom a rebellion, and it cost him everything." "You didn't kill him," Lila said firmly. "Pneumonia killed him. Poverty killed him. A world without antibiotics killed him. You made a mistake, a human mistake despite what you are. But you learned from it. You've spent a century making sure no one else is trapped the way Tobias was. Until I met you, and then I didn't want to let you go and I hated myself for it. So don't let me go. Ask me to stay, not because you're trapping me, but because you want me here." Eradan set down his glass and took her hands. "Lila Zhao, will you stay with me? Not as a hostage or an obligation or even just as an envoy, but as my partner, my equal, my love. Will you build a life here, knowing what I am and what that means?" "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to all of it." He kissed her again, slower this time, thorough and claiming. When he pulled back, his eyes were bright. "There's something you should know about what being my partner means, long term." "The turning thing," Lila said. "I figured that would come up eventually. I won't ask it of you. Ever. That's your choice, always. But if you stay mortal, I'll have you for 50 years, 60 if we're lucky, and then I'll have eternity to miss you." "Or I could turn," Lila said slowly, thinking it through. "And we could have eternity together, but I'd have to give up sunlight, food, my human life. Yes, it's not a small thing, Lila. It's death and rebirth. I won't pretend otherwise. How long do I have to decide? As long as you need. Years if you want them. I'll take whatever time you give me and be grateful for it. Lila nodded slowly. It was too big a decision to make on the spot, and she was glad he understood that. But as she looked at him, at the future stretching out between them, she thought she already knew what her answer would be. Eventually. The next few months were a controlled chaos of building the Envoy program from scratch. Lila set up an office in a building halfway between the castle and Millbrook, a physical and symbolic bridge between worlds. She hired a small staff, both human and vampire. She established regular office hours and a hotline for complaints. The hunters that Brooks had invited never showed up. Turned out that the hunter crew had some standards, and attacking a court that was actively working on peaceful human integration didn't meet them. Brooks himself was under house arrest, pending trial. Lila learned to navigate vampire politics, which made human bureaucracy look straightforward by comparison. She mediated disputes over territory and blood rights and trade agreements. She gave presentations to the vampire court about human cultural sensitivities and to human town councils about vampire law and custom, and she fell deeper in love with Eradan every single day. He was nothing like she'd expected a vampire king to be. Yes, he was commanding and dangerous and absolutely ruthless when necessary. But he was also curious, asking her endless questions about the modern world he'd watched change but not always understood. He was funny in a dry, understated way that snuck up on her. He was gentle, treating her like she was made of spun glass, even though she kept proving she was tougher than that. "You hover," she told him one night when he'd appeared at her office for the third time that day on increasingly thin pretexts. "I want to make sure you're safe. The treaty is still fragile. There are those on both sides who'd love to see it fail. So you're going to lurk in my office and glare at anyone who walks in?" "If necessary." He was utterly unapologetic. Lila laughed and pulled him into a kiss. "I love you, you ridiculous, overprotective vampire king. And I love you, stubborn woman who ran back into danger for me." They settled into a rhythm. Lila lived in the castle but kept her office in town. She spent her days building bridges and her nights in Eradan's arms, learning what it meant to be loved by someone who'd survived centuries of loss and chosen to risk his heart again anyway. 6 months after that night in the town hall, Lila made her decision. She chose a significant place for it. The harvest fair in her home village, a tiny town 20 miles from Millbrook where she'd grown up. The fair was an annual tradition, a celebration of the fall harvest with food stalls and craft vendors and everyone from miles around turning up. Lila had been coordinating a vampire presence at the fair for weeks. It was part of the Integration Initiative, a chance for humans and vampires to interact in a casual, non-threatening environment. A dozen vampires from the court had volunteered, including Severina and Nikolai. Eradan had initially refused to come, certain his presence would be too intimidating, but Lila had insisted. "You're not just the vampire king," she'd told him. "You're my partner. People need to see that." So now he stood beside her in the town square as the sun set and the fair lights came on, looking slightly uncomfortable in casual clothes, but devastatingly handsome nonetheless. The locals were giving them space, but not running away. Progress. Lila took a deep breath and caught Severina's eye. The vampire woman nodded and stepped forward. "Ladies and gentlemen," Severina called out in her clear, carrying voice, "if I could have your attention for a moment. Our envoy has an announcement." The crowd quieted. Lila felt her heart hammering but kept her voice steady. "Most of you know me," she said. "I'm Lila Zhao. I grew up here. I went to Jefferson Elementary and then Millbrook High. I volunteered to serve as a human hostage under the treaty, and I came home to serve as envoy. I've been working to build peace between our communities for the past 6 months." She paused, feeling Eradan's presence at her shoulder, solid and supportive. "Tonight, I want you to witness something important. I'm choosing to turn, to become a vampire. I'm making this choice freely and publicly because I want there to be no doubt, no rumors, no questions. This is what I want. For my work, for my future, for the man I love." The crowd erupted in murmurs. Some were shocked, some were supportive, A few looked angry or disgusted. Lila had expected all of it. "I know this is hard to understand," she continued. "I know some of you think I'm making a mistake, but I've never been more certain of anything. And I want you to see that it's possible to choose this life, to bridge both worlds, to build something new." Eradan stepped forward then, taking her hand. "The turning will happen tonight, with your envoy's full consent and in the presence of witnesses from both communities. Lila will remain in her position after the turn. She will still be your representative. She will simply be equipped to do the job for longer." He said it with a slight smile, and a few people laughed nervously. "Any questions?" Lila asked. There were dozens. She fielded them patiently. What would happen to her body? Whether she'd still be herself? How the turning worked? Whether it hurt? She answered everything honestly, and when she didn't know the answer, she let Eradan or Severina explain. Finally, old Mrs. Patterson from the grocery store raised her hand. "Will you still come to the fair next year?" Lila smiled. "Every year, as long as you'll have me." That seemed to settle something for people. They started to disperse, returning to the fair, though plenty stayed to watch. Lila caught sight of her own mother in the crowd, looking worried but not hostile. They'd talked about this, though her mom had admitted she didn't fully understand. But she trusted Lila to know her own mind. As the evening wore on, something unexpected happened. People started approaching her, shyly at first, then with more confidence. They brought her food from the stalls, even though she'd soon be unable to eat it. They shared stories and memories and good wishes. 3 people came to her table to ask about job opportunities with the Envoy program. By the time full dark fell, Lila had eaten apple pie from Mrs. Henderson's stall, corn on the cob from the Peterson farm, and honey cake from the church bake sale. She'd been hugged and congratulated and interrogated and accepted. It wasn't universal, there were still cold stares and muttered insults, but it was more than she'd dared hope for. "Your people are brave," Eradan murmured as they walked through the fair together, "to accept this so readily. Some of them, anyway. The rest will come around, or they won't. But I've given them the truth, and that's all I can do." They returned to the castle near midnight. Lila had chosen to do the actual turning in private with only Eradan present. Some things were too intimate for an audience. His chambers were in the oldest part of the castle, all stone walls and tapestries and a massive 4-poster bed that probably dated back 200 years. Lila stood in the center of the room and tried not to be nervous. "We don't have to do this tonight," Eradan said quietly. "We don't have to do it at all, Lila. I meant what I said. I'll take you however I can have you." "I want this," she said firmly. "I've thought about it for months. I've weighed every option. I want eternity with you, Eradan. I want to do my work without the ticking clock of mortality. I want to be your equal in every way." "You're already my equal. Turning doesn't change that." "Maybe not. But it changes the balance of power in our relationship. Right now, you could accidentally kill me just by holding me too hard. After tonight, I'll be strong enough to push back." He smiled at that. "I look forward to it." The turning itself was less dramatic than Lila had imagined and more intimate. It required an exchange of blood, enough of his to transform her, but not so much that she lost herself. Eradan walked her through every step, giving her chances to back out, making sure she understood. When his fangs pierced her throat, it hurt for only a moment before pleasure flooded through her, warm and dizzy and overwhelming. She felt her life draining away and wasn't afraid. When he pressed his wrist to her lips and told her to drink, she did. And the taste of him was copper and night and forever. The transformation took 3 days. Lila drifted in and out of consciousness, aware of Eradan's presence beside her, his cool hand on her forehead, his voice murmuring reassurances. Her body remade itself cell by cell, dying and being reborn into something new. When she woke on the 3rd day, the world was different, sharper, brighter even in the darkness. She could hear conversations happening 3 floors away. She could smell blood pumping through veins in the next wing, and she was hungry, desperately, overwhelmingly hungry. Eradan was there immediately, pressing a crystal goblet into her hands. "Drink slowly, your body needs time to adjust." The blood was strange and perfect, satisfying the hunger in a way food never had. Lila drained the goblet and immediately wanted more, but Eradan took it from her gently. Slowly, he repeated, "Trust me, too much at once will make you ill." She wanted to argue, but found she did trust him, completely and absolutely. She let him feed her small amounts over the next few hours while her body adjusted. By evening, she felt steady enough to stand. "Come," Eradan said, offering his hand. "Let me show you your new world." He took her to the roof of the castle, where the night spread out beneath them like a jeweled blanket. Lila could see for miles, every light and shadow distinct and clear. She could hear the forest breathing around them, animals moving in the underbrush, wind rustling through leaves. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "You're beautiful," Eradan replied, pulling her close. "You were always beautiful, but now you shine with it. Immortality suits you, my love." Lila turned in his arms and kissed him. It was different now that they were matched in strength and speed. She didn't have to hold back, and neither did he. When they finally broke apart, they were both grinning. "So what now?" Lila asked. "Now, we have forever. What shall we do with it?" "Change the world," Lila said immediately. "Build something better. Prove that humans and vampires can not only coexist but thrive together." "Ambitious. You love that about me." "I love everything about you." He said it simply, like stating a fact. "And I will spend eternity proving it, if you'll let me. I'm counting on it." They stood on the roof and watched the sunrise together. It was Lila's first as a vampire, and she expected it to hurt, but the first rays of light brought only a faint discomfort, like a sunburn beginning. Eradan pulled her back into the shadows before it could get worse. "You'll build tolerance," he explained. "Old vampires can stand brief periods of sun, but it will never be comfortable." "A fair trade," Lila said. She'd known the cost, and she'd chosen anyway. No regrets. The following weeks were an adjustment. Lila had to relearn everything from her own strength to social cues now that she could hear heartbeats and smell fear. She had to navigate the vampire court politics as one of them now, not as a tolerated human. And she had to manage her envoy duties while dealing with the reality that half her constituents now saw her as the enemy. It was Mayor West who helped with that last part. She called a town meeting and stood up in front of everyone to say that Lila Zhao had been honest and brave and was still the same person, just with different dietary requirements. That if they couldn't see past that, they were the ones with the problem. It didn't win everyone over, but it was a start. And Lila found that she had allies in unexpected places. Other mixed couples started coming forward, humans dating vampires, keeping it quiet because they were afraid of judgment. With Lila and Eradan's relationship public and accepted, others felt safer being open about their own. A year after Lila's turning, the Envoy program had expanded to 3 other cities. The treaty was stronger than it had ever been. And Lila woke every evening in Eradan's arms, grateful beyond words for the choice she'd made. "Do you miss it?" Eradan asked her one night. "The sun? Food? Your mortal life?" Lila thought about it honestly. "Sometimes I miss food, especially when I smell fresh bread. And I miss my mom's cooking, though she's learned to invite me over after dinner so we can just visit. But the sun? Not really. I always preferred nighttime anyway, and my mortal life was fine, but this one is extraordinary. I have work that matters. I have you. I have forever to figure out what else I want to do. No, I don't miss it. Not enough to regret this." "Good, because I'm quite selfishly glad to have you." "Selfish? You?" "Utterly. Where you're concerned, I have no shame about it." She laughed and kissed him, and they spent the rest of the night tangled together in sheets that cost more than her old car, in a castle that was now home, in a life she'd chosen freely and would choose again every single time. 2 years after the turning, Lila stood in front of another town meeting, this one in a city 3 states away. They were considering joining the treaty network, establishing their own envoy program. The mayor had asked Lila to speak about her experiences. "I was a human hostage once," Lila told the assembled crowd. "I volunteered for the position because I believed in the treaty, even though I was scared. I spent 18 months learning that vampires are people, not monsters. They have honor and humor and honor. They can be as petty and noble and complicated as any human. And yes, they're dangerous. So are we. The question isn't whether we're different. It's whether we're willing to see past those differences to what we can build together. She paused, letting her gaze sweep the room. When my term was up, I was given my freedom. The gates were opened, and I walked out. I got all the way to the bus station before I realized that I didn't want to leave. I'd built a life in that castle. I'd fallen in love with their king. And when I learned that extremists were planning to use my release as justification for violence, I ran back. Not because I was trapped or brainwashed, but because I'd chosen that place and those people, because my freedom meant nothing if I used it to abandon the community I'd built. She saw people nodding, saw the understanding dawning on faces. I'm not saying you should all run off and become vampires. I'm not even saying the treaty is perfect. It's not. We're still figuring it out, still making mistakes and fixing them. But I am saying that isolation and fear lead nowhere good. Build bridges instead of walls. Choose communication over violence. Choose to see each other as people first, and let everything else be secondary. The speech earned her a standing ovation from about half the room. The other half looked skeptical, but that was okay. She'd learned that change happens slowly, one converted heart at a time. The vote to join the treaty passed by a narrow margin, and Lila counted it as a win. Eradan was waiting for her outside the hall. He'd taken to accompanying her on these trips, offering his presence as both protection and proof that vampire leadership supported the integration efforts. Now he pulled her into his arms and kissed her in full view of the exiting crowd. Excellent speech, my love, though I think you made their mayor cry. She was already emotional. The vote was close. Because you gave them hope. You always do. They flew back that night on a private plane Eradan kept for travel. Lila had learned to appreciate the perks of being partnered to a vampire king, even as she kept her own work grounded in practical reality. The flight gave them time to talk, to plan the next steps, to simply be together. I've been thinking, Eradan said as they crossed the midnight sky, about what comes next, for us, personally. Oh? Lila looked up from the treaty revision she'd been reading. We've spent 2 years building the Envoy program. It's running smoothly now. Other cities are adopting the model. You've trained replacement envoys. The work will continue whether you're directly involved or not. Are you suggesting I quit? Lila asked carefully. I'm suggesting we travel. See the world. There are vampire courts on every continent, each with their own treaties and politics and problems. We could learn from them, share what we've built, and we could simply be together. Without the constant pressure of negotiations and politics. Lila closed the folder and really looked at him. There was something vulnerable in his expression, a hope he was trying not to show too clearly. You want a honeymoon? We never had one. We went from crisis to crisis, from one emergency meeting to the next. I want time with you, Lila. Time where we're not managing disasters or mediating disputes. Time to remember why we chose this. I've never forgotten why I chose this, Lila said softly. But I like the idea of traveling together, seeing the world through your eyes, learning what 2 centuries of immortality has taught you. Then we'll do it. 6 months to start. We'll visit courts in Europe, Asia, South America. I'll show you Rome at night and Tokyo at its busiest. I'll teach you languages and history and all the little moments of beauty I've collected over the years. That sounds perfect. They left 2 weeks later, after ensuring the Envoy program was in capable hands. The travel was everything Eradan had promised and more. They walked through ancient cities and modern metropolises. They met vampire queens in Moscow and kings in Beijing. They attended blood ceremonies in Brazil and treaty negotiations in London. But the best moments were the quiet ones. Sitting together in a cafe in Paris, watching the night crowds, walking through a market in Bangkok at midnight, standing on the Great Wall of China and feeling the weight of history around them. In those moments, Lila understood what eternity really meant. Not just endless time, but infinite opportunities to discover new things, to grow and change and learn. I'm glad I ran back, she told Eradan one night as they stood on a balcony in Barcelona, the Mediterranean spread out beneath them. I'm glad I chose you. I'm glad you crashed back into my arms. Eradan replied, pulling her close. I'm glad you were brave enough to choose what you wanted instead of what you were offered. The gates were open, Lila murmured, remembering that night that felt like a lifetime ago. The road was free, and I turned back anyway, and ran straight into the arms of a vampire king who didn't deserve you. Who deserves me perfectly, Lila corrected. Who loves me enough to let me choose, who trusts me enough to believe I mean it, who spent 2 years proving that he's worth every risk I took. They kissed as the sun began to rise, and Lila felt the familiar discomfort of dawn but didn't pull away. This was her life now. Eternal nights and stolen sunrises, politics and passion, work that mattered and love that consumed. She'd given up the sun and gained the stars, and she'd never been happier. 3 years later, Lila stood at the gates of the castle where this had all begun. They'd come home after their extended travels, ready to re-engage with the northern reaches and the envoy program they'd built. The gates were closed now, not to keep people in, but simply because it was the middle of the night and there was no one coming or going. "Remember standing here?" Eradan asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "That night I sent you away?" "I remember thinking you were an idiot," Lila said fondly. "A noble, self-sacrificing idiot who couldn't see that I'd already made my choice. In my defense, I'd spent a century punishing myself. It was hard to believe I deserved another chance. And now? Now I wake every evening grateful that you were stubborn enough to come back, that you saw past my damage to what we could be together." Lila turned in his arms and kissed him. 5 years since that night she'd run back. 5 years of building something extraordinary together. 5 years of love that had only deepened with time. "Come on," she said, taking his hand. "We have a council meeting in an hour, and I want to review the new trade proposals first." "Always working," Eradan said, but he was smiling. "Always building," Lila corrected. "That's what we do. That's what we've always done." They walked back into the castle together, partners in every way that mattered. The gates behind them stood closed but never locked, because Lila had taught them all a lesson that night she'd run back. Freedom wasn't about open gates or clear roads. It was about choosing where you belonged and having the courage to claim it. And she'd chosen this. Every single day she chose it again. The council meeting was productive, establishing new trade routes and resolving a minor territorial dispute. After it ended, Lila returned to their chambers to find Eradan waiting with a smile that promised mischief. "I have something for you," he said, producing a small velvet box. "We're already married by vampire law," Lila pointed out. They'd performed the blood-binding ceremony a year ago, a private ritual that tied their lives together in ways human marriage never could. "I know. But I wanted to give you something that bridges both worlds. Something humans would recognize." He opened the box to reveal a ring, white gold set with a deep red stone that looked like crystallized blood. "Ruby," he explained, "to represent what you've given up and what you've gained. Will you marry me, Lila Zhao? In a human ceremony, with human witnesses, so that everyone knows you're mine and I'm yours?" Lila's eyes filled with tears she could no longer shed. "Yes, yes. Absolutely yes." They planned the wedding for the fall, exactly 5 years after the night she'd turned. It would be held at the castle, with guests from both communities. A human ceremony at sunset, with a vampire celebration after full dark. A literal bridge between worlds. The night before the wedding, Lila stood again at those familiar gates. This time they were wide open, decorated with flowers and lights for tomorrow's celebration. She thought about the girl who'd walked through these gates 5 years ago, scared and determined and so young. She thought about the woman who'd run back through them, choosing love over safety. And she thought about the person she was now, standing on the threshold of forever with absolutely no regrets. "Second thoughts?" Eradan's voice came from behind her. "Not even close. I was just thinking about how far we've come, how much has changed." "Some things haven't changed," he said, pulling her close. "I'm still impossibly in love with you. You're still impossibly stubborn, and we're still building something that matters. Then I'd say we're exactly where we're meant to be. The wedding the next day was beautiful and chaotic and perfect. Mayor West officiated, making it legal in human terms. Severina stood as Lila's witness, having become something close to a friend over the years. Nikolai was Eradan's, grumbling about sentiment but secretly pleased. The guest list included town councilors and vampire nobles, Lila's human family, and Eradan's immortal court. When they exchanged vows, Lila promised to choose him every day for the rest of eternity. Eradan promised to deserve that choice, to honor her agency, to love her with everything he was. They sealed it with a kiss as the sun set, perfectly balanced between day and night, human and vampire, past and future. The celebration lasted until dawn. There was music and dancing and speeches that ranged from touching to hilarious. Marcus, her first reading student, gave a toast that made everyone cry. Mayor West declared it the social event of the decade. And through it all, Lila and Eradan stayed close, touching and smiling and radiating the kind of happiness that only comes from earning it the hard way. As the last guests departed and the sun threatened the horizon, they retreated to their chambers. Eradan pulled Lila onto the balcony for one final moment under the stars. "Happy?" he asked. Deliriously, Lila replied. "You?" "Beyond measure. Thank you, Lila, for running back, for choosing this, for giving me forever with you." "Thank you for opening the gates," Lila countered. "For letting me go so I could choose to come back. For loving me enough to risk losing me." They stood together as the sky lightened, two people who'd found their way to each other through darkness and fear and, ultimately, choice. The gates were closed now, the celebration over, but it didn't matter. They'd learned the truth that night 5 years ago. Freedom wasn't about open gates or clear roads. It was about knowing where you belonged and having the courage to stay. And they belonged here, together, building their forever one night at a time. Lila turned in Eradan's arms and kissed him as the sun rose behind them, uncaring of the discomfort, unwilling to waste a moment of this perfect peace. They'd fought for this. They'd chosen it, again and again. And they'd keep choosing it for all the endless nights to come. The gates were closed, the road was clear, and Lila Zhao was exactly where she wanted to be in the arms of her vampire king, building a future that was theirs alone. Not because she had to, not because she was trapped or obligated or manipulated, but because 5 years ago she'd run back through those open gates and claimed the life she wanted. And every day since, she'd woken up grateful for that choice, for the courage it took to turn back, for the love waiting when she arrived. Forever stretched out before them, full of possibility and promise and work still to be done. But for now, in this moment, they had everything they needed, each other, and the knowledge that what they'd built together was strong enough to last eternity. The sun continued its rise. Eradan pulled Lila back into the shadows, but she was laughing, happy, complete. The gates were closed behind them. The world was changing around them, and they were together, exactly as they chose to be for all the endless nights to come.